Welcome to Black White, where truth meets justice. And appearances can be deceiving. On today's flight, a man takes his seat in first class, expecting nothing more than a smooth journey. But when a flight attendant decides he doesn't belong, a simple misunderstanding turns into a battle of power and prejudice. What the crew doesn't know is that this passenger isn't just any traveler, he's the owner of the entire airline. What happens when the one being underestimated holds all the power? Stay with us as we unravel a story of disrespect, consequences, and the ultimate revelation. The afternoon sun bathed the airport in golden light, reflecting off the sleek body of Pacific Sky Airways Flight 718. It was a luxury-class commercial flight, reserved only for the wealthiest and most elite travelers. Inside, the first-class cabin was a world of its own: plush leather seats, gold accents, and an air of exclusivity that made every passenger feel like royalty. Passengers moved with ease and confidence, their expensive luggage rolling smoothly behind them. Some barely acknowledged the flight attendants, while others accepted the champagne offered to them with polite nods. It was the kind of environment where status spoke louder than words. Standing near the entrance of the cabin was Mark Sullivan, the lead flight attendant, with his perfectly pressed uniform and neatly combed hair. Mark carried himself like he owned the place. And in a way, he believed he did. He prided himself on maintaining order, though his definition of order was based on appearances rather than rules. His smile was warm and welcoming as Mr. and Mrs. Bennett stepped onto the plane. The elderly couple, well-dressed and radiating the ease of seasoned travelers, were regulars in first class. "Welcome back, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett," Mark greeted them, his voice smooth and respectful. "It's always a pleasure to have you with us." Mrs. Bennett, a petite woman with silver hair and a soft smile, clutched her small knitting bag. "Oh, thank you, dear," she said kindly, already looking forward to another peaceful flight. Mark beamed at them, his smile lingering even after they passed. But the moment Ethan Carter stepped forward, his expression shifted. Ethan moved with quiet confidence, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit that fit his athletic frame perfectly. A well-crafted leather travel bag rested on his shoulder, and his calm, composed demeanor suggested he was a man used to being in control. But Mark didn't see a high-profile traveler. He saw someone who didn't belong. Mark's smile faded into a curt nod. "Sir," he said, his tone neutral, almost dismissive. Ethan met his gaze for a brief moment, noticing the shift. He had seen this 1,000 times before, the quiet assumptions, the silent judgments, but instead of reacting, he simply returned a polite nod and moved past him. As Ethan made his way to his assigned seat, the other passengers continued settling in. Vanessa Green, a wealthy socialite with a love for gossip, sipped her champagne, eyeing every new arrival with thinly veiled curiosity. Across the aisle, Daniel Brooks, a sharp-eyed businessman in his 50s, adjusted his cufflinks and checked his watch. A frequent flyer, Daniel was used to observing people, and he didn't like what he had just seen. Ethan found his seat by the window, setting his bag neatly beside him. As he adjusted his watch, he felt the subtle shift in energy before Mark even spoke. The lead flight attendant approached with a smirk, standing a little too close, his posture stiff with authority. "I think you're in the wrong seat, sir," Mark said smoothly. It wasn't a question. Ethan looked up, unfazed. "This is my seat." His voice was calm, steady. Mark's smirk didn't fade, but his tone sharpened slightly. "I don't think so. This section is reserved for VIP travelers, our most elite guests." A brief silence hung in the air. Ethan didn't argue, didn't get defensive. He simply raised an eyebrow. "You might want to check your passenger list before making assumptions," he said evenly. Mark let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head like he had just heard something ridiculous. "No need. I know who belongs here." Across the cabin, Vanessa Green leaned toward her friend, lowering her voice just enough for others to hear. "Looks like someone's trying to sneak an upgrade," she murmured, a smirk playing at her lips. Daniel Brooks, however, wasn't amused. He shifted in his seat, watching the interaction with growing interest. Mark straightened his posture, his voice rising just enough to make sure others could hear. "I'm going to ask you one more time, please move to the back of the plane, or I will have security escort you off." The cabin fell into an uneasy silence. Some passengers watched with open curiosity, while others pretended to scroll through their phones, pretending not to notice. Ethan didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head slightly, studying Mark the way a lion studies a much smaller animal. Then, with measured calm, he said, "Call whoever you need to. I'm not moving." A soft gasp came from the other side of the cabin. Vanessa's perfectly manicured fingers clutched her champagne glass, eyes widening in disbelief. Mark's smirk faltered. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Mark expected anger. He expected resistance. He expected Ethan to back down like so many others before him. But this man wasn't intimidated. And for the first time, Mark felt a small flicker of doubt in the back of his mind. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. Straightening his shoulders, Mark turned to Sophie Adams, the younger flight attendant standing nearby. "Sophie," he said sharply, "escort this man to economy. Now." Sophie hesitated, glancing between the two men. Her fingers gripped the passenger list tightly, and she looked like she wanted to speak, but Mark's sharp glare froze her in place. Reluctantly, she nodded and took a step forward. Ethan remained seated, completely composed. His calmness only made Mark more agitated. "You might want to rethink what you're doing," Ethan said quietly, his voice even softer than before. Something about his tone sent a chill down Mark's spine. But Mark scoffed, waving off the warning. "I know exactly what I'm doing," he sneered. "Now get up." The tension in the cabin crackled like static. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some whispering among themselves. But Ethan still didn't move. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his seat, gaze steady on Mark. "You shouldn't make assumptions about people," he said quietly. Mark let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "And you shouldn't be sitting in seats you didn't pay for." The moment hung in the air, heavy with unspoken weight. Then, without breaking eye contact, Ethan slowly reached for his phone. He typed something quickly, then set the device down on the armrest beside him. The simple action sent a ripple of unease through Mark. "What do you think you're doing?" Mark snapped. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply leaned back, adjusting his cuffs. Then, in the same calm voice, he said, "You'll find out soon enough." A thick silence settled over the first-class cabin. The hum of the engines was the only sound filling the space. But even that seemed distant compared to the tension crackling between Mark and Ethan. Mark folded his arms, shifting his weight onto one foot, his smirk still lingering, but now, there was a flicker of uncertainty behind it. He had expected Ethan to lose his temper, to demand to speak to a manager, to cause a scene like other passengers had before. But this man was different. Too calm, too collected. Ethan sat there, completely at ease, as if he had all the time in the world. His phone rested on the armrest beside him, the screen now dark, but its presence felt like a loaded weapon. Across the aisle, Daniel Brooks, the businessman who had been quietly observing, leaned forward. His sharp eyes flicked between Ethan and Mark, his brow furrowing in concern. A few rows ahead, Vanessa Green nudged her friend, whispering, "This is getting interesting." Her fingers absently traced the rim of her champagne glass. Enjoying the drama, Sophie, the younger flight attendant, shifted uncomfortably. She stole a glance at the passenger list still clutched in her hand, her fingers tightening around the clipboard. Her gut told her something wasn't right. Mark finally exhaled, a sharp breath through his nose. "All right, have it your way," he muttered. Then, louder, so the rest of the cabin could hear, he said, "I'll call security." He turned on his heel and strode toward the front of the plane. Pulling out his radio, passengers murmured, some pretending not to watch, others openly staring. Daniel shook his head. He had seen power struggles like this before, usually in corporate boardrooms. Not at 30,000 feet. But one thing was clear. Ethan wasn't the one losing control. Mark was. Ethan didn't so much as glance at the flight attendant storming off. Instead, he calmly picked up his phone again, typed a quick message, then set it back down. He knew exactly what was coming. A few minutes later, Mark returned, looking smug, his radio clipped to his belt. He glanced around the cabin, making sure he had an audience before stopping in front of Ethan again. "Well," he he said, voice dripping with satisfaction. I hope you enjoyed your little stunt. Security is on their way. Ethan finally looked up, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. Not worry, not fear. Something that made Mark's stomach twist, though he wasn't sure why. You really should have checked that passenger list, Ethan said, voice smooth, almost amused. Mark let out a short laugh, shaking his head. I don't need to. At that exact moment, the intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have been given special instructions and will be making an unscheduled landing. Please remain seated. A ripple of confusion spread through the cabin. Passengers sat up straighter. A few exchanged looks, murmuring. Even Vanessa Green's smirk faded as she set down her champagne glass. Mark's cocky expression froze. His head snapped toward the cockpit door. What? He muttered under his breath. Ethan didn't answer. He just leaned back in his seat, watching Mark with quiet amusement. A few minutes later, the plane descended smoothly, touching down on the private runway of an exclusive executive terminal. Outside the window, a sleek black SUV waited on the tarmac. Two sharply dressed executives stepped out, their presence exuding authority. Mark's confidence finally cracked. When the aircraft door finally opened, Captain Harris himself stepped out of the cockpit and walked straight toward Mark. Step aside, the captain ordered, his voice firm. Mark blinked. Excuse me? Captain Harris didn't even hesitate. We've received a direct order from corporate. His eyes shifted briefly to Ethan, then back to Mark. Mark stiffened. What order? He demanded. But his voice didn't have the same edge it did earlier. Then came the words that hit the room like a thunderclap. The owner of this airline is on board, Captain Harris said, and he's sitting right there. All heads snapped toward Ethan. A sharp inhale came from Vanessa Green. Her eyes went wide as she turned to her friend. No way. Daniel Brooks smiled knowingly, shaking his head. Mark? Mark looked like he had just been punched in the gut. What? The words stumbled out of his mouth, barely audible. Ethan finally stood. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket, then turned calmly to face Mark. You didn't bother to check the list, he said smoothly, because you already decided I didn't belong. Mark opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. I didn't know. Ethan tilted his head slightly. And that's the problem, isn't it? Mark's skin turned ghostly pale. Passengers stared in stunned silence, some whispering under their breath. Ethan let the silence hang for a moment before he sighed, shaking his head. I own this airline, he said. I built it to provide exceptional service to every passenger, not just the ones you personally approve of. Mark's hands clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling faster now. Listen, Mr. Carter. You're fired, Ethan said. His voice was soft, but the impact was deafening. A small gasp came from Sophie, the younger flight attendant, who had been standing quietly behind them. Mark staggered back a step. Wait, no, you can't. Two uniformed officers, Detective Owens and Officer Riley, stepped forward. Ethan turned to them, his voice calm. This man assaulted me in front of multiple witnesses. He gestured toward the other passengers, many of whom still looked stunned by what had just happened. Vanessa Green, the socialite, quickly looked away, pretending to fix her hair. Daniel Brooks, however, stood up from his seat. I'll testify to that, he said, his voice firm. Mark's face drained of color. One of the officers pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Mark Sullivan, you're under arrest for assault. Mark took a step back, shaking his head wildly. Wait, this is all a misunderstanding. You didn't mean to get caught. Ethan interrupted, his tone razor sharp. But you did, and now, you'll face the consequences. The officers moved in, locking the cuffs around Mark's wrists. Passengers watched in stunned silence as he was escorted down the aisle, his once cocky demeanor now completely shattered. Ethan turned back to the remaining flight attendants. His sharp gaze landed on Sophie. You stood back when you knew this was wrong, he said, but then his expression softened. But you also tried to help. Sophie swallowed hard, nodding. Ethan smiled slightly. You'll be hearing from my office. Expect a promotion. A few passengers began clapping. Then more. The sound grew louder, until it filled the entire cabin. Ethan simply adjusted his cuffs again, letting the applause wash over him. Justice had been served. The rhythmic click of Mark's polished shoes against the cabin floor had been a sound of authority just moments ago. But now, as he was escorted off the plane in handcuffs, it was the walk of shame. Passengers watched in silence, their eyes tracking every movement as Officer Riley and Detective Owens led him down the aisle. His once proud posture had collapsed, shoulders slumped under the weight of reality. Vanessa Green, the socialite who had openly mocked Ethan earlier, suddenly found her champagne far more interesting than the scene unfolding in front of her. Across the aisle, Daniel Brooks sat back in his seat, arms crossed, nodding slightly in approval. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it, as if searching for some last-ditch excuse, some way out, but there was none. His arrogance had carried him too far. As he reached the exit, he turned his head slightly, looking back at Ethan one last time. A silent, desperate plea. Ethan met his gaze with cool indifference. The message was clear. You did this to yourself. The doors closed behind Mark with a dull thud. And just like that, he was gone. A strange stillness settled over the first-class cabin, like the moment after a thunderstorm when the sky is still heavy with what just happened. Then, from the back of the cabin, someone started clapping. At first, it was slow, hesitant. Then another person joined in. And another. Within seconds, the entire cabin erupted into applause. Ethan didn't bask in it. He simply adjusted his suit cuffs, as if nothing had happened, then turned to Captain Harris. Let's not keep these good people waiting any longer, he said smoothly. Captain Harris, looking more relieved than anyone, nodded immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be departing shortly. Thank you for your patience, he announced over the intercom. The tension broke. Conversations picked up again. The flight attendants, now free from Mark's oppressive presence, moved more easily through the aisle. Sophie, the junior flight attendant, approached Ethan, her expression a mix of nerves and gratitude. Mr. Carter, she started, then hesitated. Ethan gave her an encouraging nod. Go ahead, she swallowed. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner. He studied her for a moment, then offered a small smile. You hesitated, but you still made the right choice in the end. Sophie exhaled in relief. I meant what I said earlier. Ethan added, expect a promotion soon. Her eyes widened, and for the first time that day, a genuine, unrestrained smile spread across her face. Thank you, sir, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Ethan simply nodded, then took his seat again. As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, Ethan leaned back in his seat, gazing out at the sky. He could still feel the lingering stares from other passengers. Some were curious, others respectful, and a few, like Vanessa Green, looked downright mortified for underestimating him. But he didn't care. This wasn't about proving himself to strangers. It was about setting a standard. A few hours later, as the plane descended smoothly onto the runway, Ethan's phone vibrated with an incoming notification. A news alert. He glanced down at the screen. Billionaire CEO handles discrimination with class, fires employee mid-flight. His story had gone viral. The headline wasn't what mattered. It was the conversation it would spark. Respect shouldn't be a privilege. It should be a given. And if he had to make an example out of someone to remind the world of that, so be it. As the plane came to a stop and the seatbelt sign clicked off, a flight attendant, one who had been avoiding his gaze earlier, approached him cautiously. Mr. Carter, she said softly, it's an honor to have you on board. Ethan smiled slightly. Now that's more like it. This story is a powerful reminder that respect should never be based on appearances. In a world where snap judgments happen every day, true character is revealed in how we treat others, especially those we assume have no power. As we move through this year, let's make it a point to treat everyone with dignity, no matter their status, background, or the assumptions we might hold. Because in the end, respect isn't just given to the wealthy or powerful, it's something we all deserve. If you enjoyed this story and believe in standing up for what's right, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us here at Black White for more eye-opening stories. See you in the next one.